Hi, today we're going to do a review of the Sony A1 and the 200 to 600mm zoom. I've owned this for about 3 months now, so I'm due to do a review, and it's the perfect day to do it because it's chucking it down with rain out there, and it's forecast to rain all day with thunder and lightning, so a good day to stay indoors. It's not going to be one of those detailed reviews where I talk about the dimensions of the lens and how many glass elements there are in there. I'm just going to talk about how I feel about the camera and how well it performs. And I've got to start off by talking about the autofocus, because I've been raving about the autofocus in my YouTube channel now for several weeks. As far as I can see, this is a brand new generation of autofocus. And you've got the Canon R5 and R6, which seem to be very similar. When I talk to other photographers, it seems to be equally impressive. And Nikon users are hoping that the Z9, which is coming out, is also going to be the same. But it's a huge leap forward in autofocus. For birds in flight, the way I now word this is, autofocus now works the way we always thought it ought to, but it didn't. But now it does. If you can keep the bird in the viewfinder for just half a second, it will autofocus on it and it will stay on it. It will track it very, very successfully. You've still got to do your bit as the photographer to assist it. So you have to be approximately in focus when you first press the autofocus button. If you're way out of focus and the bird is just a blur, the system won't recognize the shape of a bird, which is what it's looking for. So you still have to pre-focus. You point the camera at the floor at the distance you intend to pick up on the bird, and then you wait for the bird to get to that sort of area and put the bird in the viewfinder, half depress the button, and you'll see the focus points drop onto it, and they will track it with remarkable accuracy. Some of the early demonstrations that I saw of how good the autofocus were on YouTube and other places, there was always of quite large birds, herons, storks, waterfowl, raptors, and I would look at them and think, well, yeah, that's good, but what's it like with a small bird? It's relatively easy to focus on a large bird, autofocus on it in flight, than is a small bird. For instance, recently I photographed a peregrine. So I was pre-focusing on the grass on the cliff at about the distance where I'm first going to pick up on the peregrine. Then as it entered that area, I pressed the autofocus button, and then that's it. I can follow it along the cliff. And when it came up in the air and it was dead level with me, the autofocus stayed onto it. And I was very pleased. I thought, wow, that's wonderful. But then I thought to myself, actually my Olympus gear could have done this. It's not that difficult a picture to take, and my Canon gear before that would have done it too. It's a large bird, it's relatively slow flying. It's the fastest flying bird in the world, but that's only when it's stooping, when it's diving down to catch its prey. When it's flying along a cliff, especially into the wind, it's not going all that fast, and when it banks around, it's quite a slow flight. It's also fairly contrasty, and that helps the autofocus too. It'd be more difficult to photograph a raven, a blackbird, against a dark background. The autofocus would struggle more. Contrast helps the autofocus. For instance, these tufted duck pictures. I took these in my Canon gear, which I sold roughly 3 years ago, and I can't remember what camera model I was using at the time, but it was quite a few years back. And it's taken with the 800mm lens, a tufted duck flying towards me, and the autofocus coped with it remarkably well. But a tufted duck is quite contrasty. That helps the autofocus. So I really wanted to test this system out with small birds, and I was very lucky. Right from when I first obtained it, I had opportunity to photograph a number of small birds in flight. Missel thrushes, little owls, and sand martins, house martins, swallows, swifts, all sorts of things. And it's absolutely fantastic. Now what helps you to track the bird yourself as well is the fact the viewfinder is remarkably clear and bright. I think this is the first electronic viewfinder that I've looked through that's as clear as an optical viewfinder. It's been a long time since I looked through an optical viewfinder, but as I remember it, this is just as clear. That makes it much easier to follow your bird as well. The picture's very bright and sharp. And then you've got the fact that it doesn't black out between frames. You haven't got that flicker. which you have on other electronic cameras. When I first read about this on the A9, the Sony A9, I didn't actually believe it. I thought, no, they must be talking about something else. There has to be a blackout between frames. And it wasn't until I met someone with the Sony A9 and got to look through the viewfinder that I accepted that it was true. And it must be a huge advantage to photographing birds in flight, I thought to myself. And it is. It makes it so much easier to be able to follow that bird and keep it in the frame when there's no blackout. So that's a huge advantage. Let's talk about the noise levels, the ISO setting. Whenever I buy a new camera, the first thing I do, first day out, is I put it onto a tripod. I point it at the distance, the far distance, infinity, but then I put the focus out of focus. So I've just got a blur. And I try and pick on a spot where there's some dark areas in the picture too, because noise shows up worse in the dark areas. And then I take a whole series of pictures. I go from 50 ISO, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, all the way up to the top. Notice I'm doing one stop increments. I don't do 1/3 of a stop. If you do 1/3 of a stop, you can't see the difference between each picture. The change is too subtle. So you want whole stop increments, or at least I've always done whole stop increments in the past. Then you can see a difference when you jump from 800 to 1600, hopefully. With this camera, I'm really struggling to see the difference even at whole stop increments. Maybe I should be doing 2-stop increments these days to be able to see the difference. With my Olympus gear, when I got to 400 ISO, I had seen no difference in the pictures whatsoever. So 100 ISO and 400 looked identical. When I went to 800, I could see a little bit of noise just came into the picture. So with my Olympus gear, 400 ISO has become my default setting. That's what I normally shoot at. I don't go slower. There's no point in going slower than 400. I can't see less noise. I'm quite happy to go higher, but I don't go lower than 400. With this camera, I got to 1600 and hadn't seen any sign of any noise. All the pictures looked identical. When I went to 3200, I had to stare at it very hard, and I thought, yes, I think I can see a bit of noise there. And then I'm flicking backwards and forwards between 1600 and 3200, and eventually I convinced myself there was just a touch of noise coming into the picture. So I've settled on 1600 as my default setting. I don't want to go any slower than that, but I'm very happy to go faster with it. 3200, 6400. It's almost as if noise has been eliminated. It's no longer really an issue. I mean, 1600 ISO to me is incredibly fast since I started off on 64 ISO Kodachrome film. So it just seems life is very easy. So that's become my default setting, but you can shoot on much faster ISOs, and also the effect of noise and ISO is related to the light. If you're shooting in good light, you can shoot at very high ISOs if you really want a super fast shutter speed. Noise starts to show up more in really dull, miserable light, and that's when you're pushing the ISO, and then it does become more of an effect on the picture. But it is remarkably good for its noise levels. Talking about the overall image quality, well, I find this very difficult. How do you describe image quality? It's something you've really just got to look at. I'm still shooting with the Olympus, so there are days when I'm taking pictures with both camera systems. Then when I download them to my computer, I put them in the same folder and I start to edit them, decide which ones I'm keeping, which ones I'm getting rid of. I do not notice any difference between the image quality of the Sony camera versus the Olympus, and I wouldn't expect to. I've never been able to look at a picture and tell you what camera it's taken with. I can look at a picture and tell you what lens it might have been taken with, whether it's a telephoto or a wide angle, but can I tell from a picture what camera was used? No, never been able to do that. So I wouldn't expect to be able to, other than the ratio is different. The Olympus is a 4:3 ratio and this is a 3:2 ratio. But if I'm just looking at the picture quality, they're both fine. I'm shooting a slightly lower ISO with the Olympus, 2 stops less, but the picture quality with both systems is just excellent. And any modern camera today is excellent. So I'm just very happy with the image quality. That's all I can really say on that subject. We'll talk about the file sizes. They are huge, 8,640 pixels on the long edge of the file. Some years ago, I kept asking myself, why are manufacturers increasing the megapixels of the camera? We don't need bigger files. Get perfectly good A3 prints out of these files at this size. Why the need to go bigger? I'd rather have a higher frame rate than a bigger file. Well, now we've got both. We've now got 30 frames per second on this camera, and the Canon R1 I think is offering 40 frames per second, or is it rumoured to be 40 frames? I'm not sure at this point, but anyway, they've got faster and faster frame rates and the file sizes have grown. But now, for the first time, I'm appreciating the file size, because I can now aggressively crop my pictures in post-production, so I'm deliberately trying to shoot birds smaller in the frame. Now, with a bird in flight, it's much easier to be able to shoot it smaller in the frame. You can keep it in without clipping its wings, and then afterwards you're cropping it down, and you can crop it a long way with such a big file size. I'm also trying to do birds on branches smaller, or birds on the floor, because I know that afterwards, if I want to, I can crop in and put it to a normal size and still have as big a file as I can with any other camera I've ever owned. And if the bird does something, it does a wing stretch or suddenly jumps up in the air, I'm not going to miss it, because I was doing it small enough in the frame to still include it in the picture. So I'm trying to force myself to do this. It's quite difficult to do. You sort of automatically go to your normal image size, and I have to keep reminding myself, no, let's do it a bit smaller, I can crop it afterwards. The 30 frames per second, do I appreciate that? Yes, I do. Of course, it gives you the headache of a lot more pictures to edit, but I've always been quite quick at doing that. But it makes a noticeable difference. My Olympus is 18 frames per second at continuous focus. This doesn't actually give me 30 unless I've got all the settings correct, or appropriate settings, but I've never bothered to count. Whether I'm getting 26, 27, 28, 29 frames per second, I've not bothered counting. It really doesn't matter. What I can see is I'm getting a lot of frames per second. And when I'm photographing a bird in flight, I'm getting a lot more wing positions. So it gives you the choice of finding the perfect position in the wings. You get it on the upbeat and the downbeat and the middle beat, and it gives you lots and lots of options when you're selecting your picture. You can't really have too many frames per second, especially when you're doing action type photography. Just a few slightly negative things. The ergonomics of the camera, how does it feel? How do the dials and the buttons? It wasn't until I sold all my Canon gear, which is approximately 3 years ago now, that I realised how slick Canon cameras were. The pressure you needed to press a button to operate it was absolutely perfect. The same with the dials, just the right pressure to be able to turn them. And it's one of those things you don't appreciate until you've lost it. But my Olympus gear is nowhere near as slick, and this isn't either. The buttons don't have that same wonderful feel as they do on a Canon camera. When you run your finger across the top feeling the buttons, the Canon ones just protruded just the right amount, and they got a lovely rounded top to them, and they just had that right amount of pressure to operate. This, I think, they're too light. They press too readily, and I've found I've been accidentally pressing buttons all the time on this camera. Same for the dials. I managed to change the dials. The left-hand dial has a button in the middle of it which you have to depress before you can turn it, and yet somehow, accidentally, I've managed to turn that dial. Perhaps I'm a bit rough and clumsy with cameras, but it's happened a couple of times with the left-hand dial, and the various buttons I'm accidentally pressing. So they're not quite as well designed from that point of view, but it's not a major problem. The most irritating one is the video button, which is right next to the viewfinder. The video button is normally right next to your shutter button on every camera I've owned. Now that's solvable because you can customize your various buttons. So the C1 button, which is right next to the shutter button, I've turned that into the video button by going into the settings. So I've overcome that. The most annoying is the compensation dial. That's quite awkward, and that's the one you're turning the most often. You're under or overexposing as you're taking pictures. I need to turn that quite quickly, And on previous cameras I can just do it with my thumb, but on this camera it doesn't overlap the body, so it's quite awkward to turn it with just your thumb. More often than not I have to take two fingers, or my thumb and a finger, to be able to turn the dial. Slows you down just a touch. They're not quite as well thought out as those Canon cameras. Battery life. I've now got 3 batteries, and there are days when I get through all 3 of them. It could be because the viewfinder is very clear and bright, probably more likely because I shoot a lot of video today, far more than I used to, and I'm sure video uses up more battery power than stills pictures. But it does get through the batteries. But on the plus side, they're not the most expensive batteries in the world, 20 something pound each. There are other cameras where they're £100 plus, so I need to buy another one, but the battery power, it does drain them more than other cameras that I've owned. But the biggest single problem that I've hit since owning it is dust on the sensors, and I wondered if I would. In my Canon days, I had big problems with dust on the sensors. It was a major issue for me, mainly with the full chip camera. So that was the 1DX at the end, and I used to have the sensor cleaned professionally every 6 months or so. I used to go to a shop which is just over an hour's drive. If you pre-booked it, they'd do it while you waited. You'd have to go for a walk for an hour and come back. But then within a couple of weeks of using it, dust would start to accumulate again. Now, I was really only shooting stills pictures in those days, so it just meant I had to de-dust during the post-production, which was a bit time consuming. With the smaller chip cameras, I didn't have such a problem. So the 7D Mark IIs that I was using at the end, I could clean those myself. So I used to use those wet wipes, the swabs that you poured a bit of liquid over, and I could clean the small chip cameras. I couldn't clean the full chip cameras. I could never get it right. Other people could, I couldn't, which is why I had to take the full chip camera in to be cleaned for me. I've got some visual aids to try and illustrate why I think that was. If you imagine this butter dish is where your camera sensor is, so this is the aperture where your lens normally fits here. You're looking in towards the sensor. Well, on a full chip camera, the sensor fills the bottom of that aperture from left to right and top to bottom. So when you put your wet swab into this end here and you went across, I just found it smudged at the end where I finished the wipe, and it left the debris in that corner, or that edge rather. Smaller chip camera, not such a problem, because that black line I've put in there, a bit of tape, that's the border around the sensor. The sensor's on the inside of that black tape. So when I put my swab in, I start off on the border, not on the sensor, and I go across and I go past the sensor onto the next border. So the smudging and the debris I left behind was on the border and not on the sensor. So that's why I felt I was being successful in cleaning the smaller chipped cameras, and could never get a clean swipe of a full chipped. Same with this, it's a full chip camera, so I was very reluctant to try and clean it. But very early on I got some dust on the sensor, almost in the center of the picture, and I had to start dedusting my stills, but it's very much more difficult to dedust video. It can be done, there's workaround for it, but it's not a simple thing to do. So I got dust on the sensor with this camera quite early on, and initially I was able to get rid of it with just the blower brush, turning the camera upside down and puffing into it. But then I got some that was more persistent, it just wouldn't go away, and I was very reluctant to get the swabs out and start cleaning it again. And I thought, if I start going back to that shop, I'm now going to have to go more frequently because I'm shooting video and I can't afford to have any dust on the sensor with video. I tried something called dust pads and that didn't work. And then I bumped into another photographer and he had a Sony A9, and I asked him if he'd got the problem, and he said yes, and he uses a lens pen. So thank you, Kev, it does work. I managed to buy one, a lens pen and a loop, off eBay. I think I paid £39 for it. That was because it was in a damaged package, but it was brand new, and I found that works a treat. So I'll put the description or the website in the description of this video. It comes with a loop. I bought the kit. You can just buy the pen, but I wanted the loop that comes with it. So we take that off, and the cap at the end, and then you unscrew it. We'll take the camera body off. And the idea is you're just putting your loop on top of there, but you've got a light in it. So switch here. So we have a series of LED lights, and you're putting that on the top. And then you take the top off your pen, and on the side of this there's a large aperture here, so we can put the pen in there and down onto the sensor. You can see the dust you're trying to remove. The particular bit of dust that I was having the issue with was almost in the center of the sensor, so I was able to see it as soon as I looked through and remove it with that, and it worked a treat. I'm just going to put the body back on because I don't want to get more dust in there. Now, for some reason with this particular camera, when I rest it on the aperture, it's not in focus, so I do have to hold it up slightly. I've seen some other people make themselves a special mount, but I don't have any problem just holding it. I can see very clearly and get rid of the dust. So that has worked very well. I've used it twice already. But otherwise, dust on a sensor for me with the full chip camera is always a problem. And I've only got the one lens. It's not as if I'm changing lenses that often, but what I am doing is putting the 1.4 extender on and off quite frequently as I'm photographing. So I guess that's when I'm getting dust in the sensor. Oh, the other thing I've done to try and avoid the problem of getting dust is, you see I've got a neoprene cover on this. This comes from Lens Camo, £35 I think. The cost of neoprene covers has come down a lot. When they first became popular some years ago, I remember looking at them and thinking, oh, it's going to cost me over £100 to put that cover on a lens. But there's a lot more manufacturers now, so they've come down in price, and it looks good and it fits absolutely perfectly. It seems very well made, but the cover at this end, at the camera end, went right up to the body, and I thought, because I'm taking my camera body off and back on with the 1.4 extender such a lot, it's probably going to get dust underneath there. So I've actually cut it back a bit, and I've given myself about a centimetre where I've cut it off, so it's not touching the camera body. I just imagine dust dropping out of there into the camera as I'm changing it. During the roughly 3 years that I've owned the Olympus Micro Four Thirds system, I haven't had a dust issue. Occasionally I get a bit of dust on the sensor and I get a few pictures with it, but I can see that when I switch the camera off and back on again, it clears it. The vibration system in there manages to shake the dust off. I can't really explain why I don't get dust on Micro Four Thirds cameras, but I don't. I don't get it with the G9 either, Panasonic G9. So that's the camera body. Let's talk about the 200 to 600mm lens. First of all, it's a bargain price, £1,599. That's in the British shops. There are also the grey importers you could buy from. It's readily available from them too. Roughly £200 cheaper, I think. Optically, it's very good. You'll be very happy with the pictures. They look razor sharp and no problems with it at all. Would there be an advantage to using a 600 f4? My expectation would be, yes, you would see a slight improvement. If you had the 600 f4 and this 200 to 600, and you took the same picture from the same place, same bird, and you brought them up on the computer side by side, and that's very important. You've got to have both pictures side by side. Probably you would see a marginal difference in the 600 f4. It would have the edge. It's one of those things again where you'd have to keep looking and staring at it hard and think, yeah, that is just marginally better. If you looked at them 10 minutes apart, you'd probably have trouble guessing as to which was taken with which lens. You've got to be looking at them side by side. So that's a pretty minor difference. And you've got to trade that off against the fact you've got a zoom lens. and a zoom lens for me would win every day. The trouble with using a big straight telephoto, and for years that's what I was using, the Canon 800mm, I had a Canon 600mm, a 500mm at various times, and you missed a lot of pictures because sometimes the bird just came too close to you, or you clipped the wings as it was flying towards you. Now you've got a zoom lens that's optically very, very good. Well, I'd go for the zoom lens every time. If I had the money to buy the 600 f4, I wouldn't. I would rather stick with a zoom lens. And it's even more so with video, because it's very important to have different image sizes with video in order to be able to edit all your clips together. So that's it. That's what I think about the Sony A1 and the 200 to 600. I'm still hanging on to my Olympus equipment, really hoping in the next generation of Olympus cameras they're able to catch up. I find it very difficult using two systems at the same time, so I want to really go back to just using Olympus. Thanks for watching.